The rain came down like nails against the dirt road leading out of Thornwick, each drop heavy and cold, turning the November evening into a wall of gray. 8-year-old Elara clutched her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, her shoes, already worn through at the soles, squelching in mud that seemed determined to pull her down with every step. She had been walking since the orphanage matron told her there was no room, that the building was full, that perhaps she could try the church in the next town over, but the next town was 12 miles away, and night was falling fast. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and her fingers had gone numb hours ago. The small bundle she carried, everything she owned in the world, felt heavier with each mile. Inside were her father's worn leather gloves, the ones that still smelled faintly of horse and hay, and a photograph of her parents on their wedding day, creased from being held too many times by hands that missed them desperately. They had died 3 weeks ago. The fever took her mother first, then her father 2 days later. Elara had watched them slip away in the cramped room they rented above the stable where her father worked, helpless to do anything but hold their hands and whisper promises she didn't know how to keep. The road curved, and through the driving rain, Elara saw it, a massive barn standing alone in a field, its silhouette dark against the storm-bruised sky. The structure leaned slightly to one side, as if the years had finally grown too heavy for its frame to bear, but the roof appeared intact, and that was all that mattered. Shelter, warmth, a place to rest before facing another impossible tomorrow. She knew this barn. Everyone in Thornwick knew it. The cursed barn where Old Ruth had lived before she died 5 months ago. The locals whispered about it in the market square, crossing themselves when they passed it on the road. They said Ruth had been a witch, that she'd cursed the land, that strange things happened in that barn after dark. Children dared each other to approach it, but none ever did. Elara didn't believe in curses. Her father had taught her that fear was just a lack of understanding, that the world was strange and beautiful and sometimes frightening, but never malicious. Still, as she approached the barn's massive doors, her heart hammered against her ribs with something that felt dangerously close to terror. The doors hung open slightly, one hinge broken, creaking in the wind. Elara slipped through the gap into darkness that smelled of old hay and something else, something alive and warm that made her freeze just inside the threshold. She wasn't alone. The barn was enormous inside, far larger than it appeared from the road. Moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof and walls, creating pools of silver that illuminated sections of the vast space. And in those pools of light, Elara saw them. Horses. Not one or two, but many. Their dark shapes moved restlessly in the shadows, and eyes reflected the moonlight like stars caught in wells of darkness. Some stood in stalls whose gates had been left open. Others moved freely through the barn's central aisle. The sound of their breathing filled the space, a rhythmic living pulse that surrounded Elara completely. Her father had been a horse trainer before the stable where he worked closed down. He'd taught Elara everything he knew, starting when she was barely old enough to walk. She knew how to read their body language, how to approach them, how to earn their trust through patience and respect. But these horses felt different. Wild, wary, watching her with an intensity that spoke of trauma, survived rather than trust given freely. Elara's teeth chattered from the cold, and exhaustion pulled at her like weights attached to her bones. She needed to rest, needed warmth, needed to close her eyes for just a few hours before facing whatever came next. In the corner, she spotted a pile of old hay, relatively clean and dry, positioned between 2 stalls. It would have to do. Elara made her way there slowly, keeping her movements small and non-threatening, aware of the horses tracking her progress. She settled into the hay, pulling her thin coat around herself, and within moments, despite her fear and discomfort, exhaustion claimed her. She didn't see the horses begin to move, didn't feel them approach one by one, drawn by something they recognized in this small, shivering child. Didn't know that, as her breathing steadied into the rhythm of sleep, they formed a circle around her, a living barrier against the cold and the darkness and whatever else might threaten something small and vulnerable, seeking shelter in a place the world had abandoned. The cursed barn held its secrets close that night, but the horses knew what the villagers had forgotten. That sanctuary recognized sanctuary, and the abandoned protected their own. Elara woke to warmth, not the gentle warmth of blankets or fire, but the massive, radiating heat of large bodies pressed close. Her eyes snapped open to find herself surrounded by a wall of horses, 10 of them, she counted quickly, standing in a tight circle around her makeshift bed of hay. Some were lying down, their bodies curved protectively inward. Others stood like sentinels, ears swiveling to catch every sound, eyes alert and watchful. The black stallion stood directly in front of her, magnificent and scarred, his coat bearing marks of old wounds that spoke of battles survived. He watched her with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, and in them, Elara recognized something familiar. Grief. Loss. The particular kind of wariness that came from trusting the world and being betrayed by it. She sat up slowly, careful not to startle them, though they showed no signs of alarm. Dawn light filtered through the barn's broken boards, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. In the daylight, she could see the barn more. Clearly, could see that someone had cared for this place once, had maintained it with love and dedication. The stalls, though old, were sturdy and clean. Water troughs had been filled, though the water was days old now, covered with a thin film of dust and debris. Hay still filled the loft above, and grain bags sat stacked in the corner. This hadn't been a place of curses. This had been a sanctuary. Elara stood, and the horses shifted to give her space, but didn't break their protective formation. She approached the black stallion carefully, one hand extended, letting him smell her. He snuffled against her palm, then pressed his massive head against her shoulder with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. "Hello," she whispered. "I'm Elara. What's your name?" Of course, he couldn't answer, but as she looked around the barn, she spotted something that might. A small office door stood ajar near the back of the barn, and through it, she could see a desk covered in papers. Elara moved toward it, the stallion following like a shadow, and the other horses gradually dispersed to drink from the troughs or nose at the remaining hay. The office was simple: a wooden desk, a chair, shelves lined with veterinary supplies and books about horse care. But it was the journal lying open on the desk that caught Elara's attention. The handwriting was shaky but legible, and as Elara read, the truth about this place began to unfold like a map of pain and purpose. March 12th, found another one today. Bay mare, maybe 5 years old, beaten so badly she flinches at shadows. Named her Grace because that's what she'll need to learn to trust again. 10 horses now. 10 souls nobody wanted. 10 lives the world tried to break. But not here. Here they heal. Elara flipped back through the pages, reading entry after entry, each one documenting a rescue, a healing, a transformation. The journal's author was Ruth, the woman the villagers had called a witch, the one they'd feared and shunned. But these pages told a different story. They spoke of someone who saw suffering and couldn't look away, who dedicated her life to saving creatures others had discarded. The black stallion's name was Storm, rescued from a man who'd beaten him for being too spirited. The gray mare was Whisper, found abandoned and starving. Each horse had a name, a history, a reason for the scars they carried and the wariness in their eyes. The final entry was dated 5 months ago. "I'm dying. The doctor says weeks, maybe a month if I'm lucky. I've made my peace with it. What troubles me is what happens to them after I'm gone. The villagers won't care for them. They fear what they don't understand. And they've never understood that healing and magic are sometimes the same thing. I've written it in my will. The barn and all it contains goes to the child the horses choose. Let the law make sense of that. I trust the horses more than I trust lawyers." Elara's hands trembled as she set down the journal. The child the horses choose. The horses had chosen her, had formed a protective circle around her while she slept, had kept her warm through a night that might have killed her otherwise. But what did that mean? Could she really stay here? Could a child her age care for 10 horses alone? The sound of voices outside shattered her thoughts. Angry voices, multiple people approaching. Elara moved to the barn's front entrance and peered through the gap in the doors, her heart sinking at what she saw. A mob. At least 20 villagers, some carrying torches despite the daylight, others wielding tools that could serve as weapons. They marched up the dirt road toward the barn with grim determination, and at their head was the mayor of Thornwick, a fat man named Benson, who Elara recognized from the market square. "Time to burn it down," someone shouted. "Cursed place has stood empty long enough. The land's worth something, but not with this evil barn on it." They were coming to destroy the sanctuary, to to erase Ruth's legacy and scatter the horses to whatever fate awaited unwanted animals in a town that had already proven it had no room for compassion. Elara looked back at the horses, at Storm standing alert and tense, sensing danger. These creatures had protected her when she had nothing, had given her warmth when she might have frozen, had chosen her for reasons she didn't fully understand but felt in her bones were important. She could run, could slip out the back and disappear before the mob arrived, could save herself and let the barn fall. Or she could stay. The choice crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. These horses had stood with her. Now it was her turn to stand with them. Elara pushed open the barn doors fully and stepped out into the morning light. The mob stopped mid-stride, surprise rippling through the crowd at the sight of a small child emerging from the barn they'd come to destroy. Mayor Benson's face reddened with a mixture of confusion and irritation. "What in blazes?" he sputtered. "Girl, what are you doing in there? That barn's dangerous. Cursed. Get away from it before—" "It's not cursed," Elara said, her voice smaller than she wanted but steady. "It's a sanctuary. Ruth wasn't a witch. She rescued horses that nobody wanted. She saved them." A woman in the crowd laughed bitterly. "Rescued? That woman practiced dark arts. Everyone knows it. Strange things happened here. Lights in the night, sounds that weren't natural. We're burning this place down before it spreads more evil." "The lights were from her lantern when she worked late treating injured horses," Elara countered, piecing together what she'd read in the journal. "The sounds were horses healing from trauma. There's no evil here, just animals that need care." "And who are you to speak for Ruth?" Benson demanded. "You're just a child, the orphan girl with nowhere to go. The barn's abandoned, and abandoned property reverts to the town. We've decided it needs to go." Behind Elara, she heard the horses moving. They emerged from the barn one by one, drawn by the commotion, by the sense of threat hanging heavy in the air. Storm came first, positioning himself directly beside Elara, his massive body a living shield. Then came the others: Whisper, Grace, Thunder, Star, Shadow, Hope, Dawn, River, and Sky. 10 horses forming a semicircle behind one small girl, their message clear even if they couldn't speak it. She was under their protection. The crowd fell silent, seeing for the first time the reality of what Ruth had been doing. These weren't wild, cursed beasts. These were scarred survivors, thin but cared for, wary but not vicious. One mare bore burn marks on her flanks. A gelding was missing part of his ear. The evidence of human cruelty was written on their bodies for anyone willing to actually look. "She saved them," Elara said again, louder now. "Saved them from people who hurt them. Gave them a place to heal. And now you want to burn it down because you're afraid of what you don't understand. But there's nothing to fear here. Just broken things that found a way to be whole again." A man near the front lowered his torch slightly. "The girl's got a point, Benson. Those horses don't look cursed. Look half-starved, actually. When's the last time anyone checked on this place?" "That's not our responsibility," Benson snapped, but his conviction was wavering. The visual before him, a child and 10 horses standing together in defiance, was hard to reconcile with his narrative of curses and evil. "Ruth's will named her," a new voice said from the back of the crowd. An elderly man pushed forward, dressed in the dark suit of a lawyer, carrying a leather case. "I'm Harold Finch, Ruth's attorney. Been meaning to execute the will, but couldn't find the child the horses choose. Seems they've chosen." He looked at Elara appraisingly. "You're the orphan girl. Parents died of fever 3 weeks back. Father was Marcus, the horse trainer." "Yes, sir. Ruth's will is unusual, but legally binding. Everything, the barn, the land, all animals on the property, goes to the child the horses choose. She believed the horses would know who could carry on her work. Looks like she was right." He pulled out documents from his case. "This property belongs to Elara now, assuming she accepts the responsibility, and assuming you all stop trying to burn down what's legally hers." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Burning down an abandoned barn was one thing. Destroying a child's legal property while she stood in front of it was another matter entirely. But Mayor Benson wasn't done fighting. "She's 8 years old. She can't care for 10 horses alone. She can't manage property. This is absurd." "The law doesn't specify an age for inheritance," Finch replied dryly, "and Ruth established a trust fund specifically for the barn's maintenance. There's money enough for feed, veterinary care, and basic needs for years if managed properly. The Girl won't be alone in this. Ruth arranged for support from the county agricultural office. All legal, all proper. Elara's mind reeled. The barn was hers. The horses were hers. She had a home, a purpose, resources to actually make it work. The impossibility of her situation had transformed into possibility in the space of a few sentences. But the crowd was still there, still uncertain, still influenced by years of fear and misunderstanding. She needed to do more than defend the barn. She needed to change how they saw it. "I know you're scared," Elara said, addressing the crowd directly. "My father taught me that fear makes people do terrible things to protect themselves. But there's nothing here to fear. These horses are gentle. They protected me last night when I had nowhere else to go. Kept me warm when I might have died from the cold. They chose to help someone who couldn't help herself. That's not evil. That's grace." She walked forward, past Storm, right up to the edge of where the mob stood. Some people stepped back instinctively, but Elara knelt in the dirt and placed both hands flat on the ground in a gesture of submission and peace. "I'm asking you to give us a chance. Give me time to prove that this place can be something good for Thornwick. These horses can work. They can pull carts, help on farms, teach children about responsibility and care. They're worth saving. Ruth knew it, I know it, and maybe, if you look past your fear, you'll know it too." The silence stretched long and heavy. Then, slowly, Storm walked forward and lowered his massive head to nuzzle Elara's hair. The gesture was so gentle, so obviously protective and affectionate, that several people in the crowd visibly softened. A woman stepped forward, Mrs. Haley, who ran the bakery in town. "My son could use a horse to help with deliveries. Been saving up but can't afford to buy one outright. Maybe we could work something out. He could help you care for them in exchange for use of one." Others began to murmur, ideas forming, fear giving way slowly to curiosity and even compassion. Mayor Benson saw his support crumbling and made one last attempt. "This is madness. The girl's too young." "The girl has more courage than grown men who came here with torches," Mrs. Haley cut him off sharply. "Shame on us for trying to destroy something we never bothered to understand. Ruth was our neighbor for 40 years, and we called her a witch because she saw suffering we ignored. I won't be part of that shame anymore." One by one, the torches were extinguished. The mob became a crowd, and the crowd became individuals. Some apologetic, some still skeptical, but none willing to continue with the destruction they had planned. Mayor Benson left in a huff, but he was alone in his retreat. The others stayed, asking questions, offering help, seeing the horses in the barn with new eyes. And Elara, kneeling in the dirt with Storm's warm breath on her neck, and Ruth's legacy now hers to carry, felt something she hadn't felt since her parents died. Hope. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It took weeks of hard work, community support that came in fits and starts, and more exhaustion than Elara thought a body could hold. But slowly, impossibly, the cursed barn became something else entirely. Mrs. Haley made good on her offer. Her son, Thomas, was 15 and strong as an ox, and he showed up every morning to help with the heavy work, mucking stalls, hauling water, repairing fences that had fallen into disrepair during the months since Ruth's death. In exchange, he used River, a steady brown gelding, for bakery deliveries throughout Thornwick and the surrounding farms. Others followed. The blacksmith came to reshoe the horses, refusing payment, but accepting Elara's offer to let his daughter, quiet and shy, young Anne, spend time in the barn, learning to ride on gentle Whisper. The feed store owner delivered grain at cost, and his wife started bringing Elara hot meals 3 times a week, claiming she always made too much anyway. Harold Finch, the lawyer, became Elara's legal guardian and taught her how to manage Ruth's trust fund. He showed her the ledgers Ruth had kept, the careful accounting of every penny spent on the horse's care, the meticulous records that would serve as Elara's guide. Dr. Morton, the county veterinarian, came weekly to check on the horse's health and teach Elara basic medical care, how to recognize illness, how to treat minor wounds, when to call for professional help. He'd known Ruth, he admitted, had helped her with difficult cases over the years. "She had a gift," Dr. Morton said one afternoon while examining Grace's old injuries. "Could read horses like you, or I read books, knew what they needed before they knew it themselves. Seems like she saw that same gift in you." Elara wasn't sure about gifts, but she knew she understood these horses. Knew that Storm needed firm boundaries because his trauma had come from humans who were unpredictable and violent. Knew that Whisper responded to gentle touches and soft words after years of being screamed at. Knew that each horse required something different, and that caring for them meant learning their individual languages of trust and healing. The barn itself transformed under community effort. The broken door was repaired, the roof's gaps were patched, the stalls were reinforced and fresh paint, donated by the hardware store, brightened the weathered wood. What had been a place of fear became a place of pride, a testament to what a town could accomplish when it stopped running from its shame and started making amends for it. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Mayor Benson watched the barn's revival with growing resentment. He'd planned to buy the land cheap once the barn was destroyed, turn it into a profitable venture that would line his pockets and increase his influence. Instead, he'd been humiliated, overruled, made to look like a bully and a fool. He began spreading new rumors that the horses were dangerous, that having a child run the property was a disaster waiting to happen, that the trust fund was being mismanaged. None of it was true, but rumors didn't need truth to spread. They just needed fear and suspicion. And there was enough residual unease about the barn to give them fertile ground. 2 months after Elara had taken ownership, an official from the county welfare office arrived. Mrs. Pierce was a thin, severe woman who wore disapproval like armor and carried a clipboard like a weapon. "I'm here to assess whether this living situation is appropriate for a minor," she announced, inspecting the barn with obvious distaste. "I've received reports that you're living in unsanitary conditions, that you're being exploited for labor, that proper schooling is being neglected." Elara's heart sank. She'd been so focused on the horses, on proving she could care for them, that she'd neglected certain practicalities. She was living in Ruth's small cottage next to the barn, and while it was clean and warm, it was sparse. She'd been studying from old books Ruth had left behind, but she hadn't formally enrolled in school. And while she wasn't being exploited, she was certainly working harder than most 8-year-olds. "I'm learning," Elara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Dr. Morton teaches me about animals. Mr. Finch teaches me about accounting and law. Mrs. Haley teaches me cooking and household management. I'm learning more than I would in a regular classroom." Mrs. Pierce's expression suggested she was unimpressed. "Learning requires structure and qualified educators. This arrangement is highly irregular. I'll need to file a report recommending more appropriate placement." "You mean an orphanage?" Elara's throat tightened. "You want to take me away from here and put me in an orphanage?" "I want to ensure you're being properly cared for," Mrs. Pierce corrected, but her tone held no warmth. "The law is clear about child welfare." Before Elara could respond, Storm whinnied sharply from his stall. The sound was alarm, a warning, and Elara's attention immediately shifted. She'd learned to trust the horse's instincts, and Storm was telling her something was wrong. She ran to the back of the barn where Storm's stall was located and found smoke seeping through the floorboards. Fire. Someone had set fire to the barn's foundation. "Get out!" Elara screamed. "Fire! Everyone out!" Mrs. Pierce stood frozen for a crucial moment, shock overriding her training. But Elara was already moving, throwing open stall doors, releasing the horses, guiding them toward the main entrance. The smoke was getting thicker, flames starting to lick up through the old dry wood. The barn that had been her sanctuary was becoming a death trap. Thomas burst through the front doors, having seen the smoke from the road. "I've got them!" he shouted, taking control of herding the panicked horses out into the safety of the pasture. "Elara, get out! The whole structure's going up." But Elara had counted. 9 horses had made it out. 1 was missing. Sky, the smallest, a dappled gray filly who'd been so traumatized by her previous owner that she still spooked at shadows. She'd hidden in the far corner of the loft when the fire started, and now she was trapped. Elara didn't think. She just ran toward the ladder leading to the loft, ignoring Mrs. Pierce's shouts, ignoring the heat that was building, ignoring everything except the terrified whinny coming from above. The loft was full of smoke, visibility near zero. Elara crawled on her hands and knees, calling for Sky, feeling her way through the choking darkness. She found the filly pressed against the far wall, trembling and wild-eyed. "It's okay," Elara coughed, wrapping her arms around Sky's neck. "We're getting out of here, together." She tried to guide the filly toward the ladder, but Skye was too frightened to move. The smoke was getting worse. Elara's lungs burned. She could hear shouts from below, could feel the building shuddering as structural supports began to fail. Then hands grabbed her, strong adult hands. Thomas had followed her up, and behind him came Dr. Morton and 2 other men from town. They formed a chain, guiding Skye toward safety while making sure Elara stayed with them, until finally, blessedly, they tumbled out the barn's main entrance just as a section of the roof collapsed behind them. Elara lay in the grass coughing, her lungs desperate for clean air. Around her, the horses milled anxiously, Storm standing over her protectively, while the barn she'd fought so hard to save burned. The fire department from the next town over arrived too late to save the barn. They managed to keep the flames from spreading to the cottage and the pasture, but the barn itself was a total loss. By nightfall, all that remained was a skeleton of charred beams and ashes, smoke rising into the darkening sky, like prayers that would never be answered. Elara sat on the cottage steps, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, watching the destruction of her sanctuary. The horses were safe, gathered in the far pasture with Thomas standing watch. But the barn, Ruth's legacy, the place that had sheltered them all, was gone. Mrs. Pierce approached, her severe expression softened by shock. "You could have died. You should have left the horse." "No," Elara said quietly. "I couldn't." The fire marshal completed his investigation quickly. The burn pattern made it clear. Arson. Someone had deliberately set fire to the barn's foundation, likely hoping it would look like an accident with the old dry wood and faulty wiring. Mayor Benson was brought in for questioning when witnesses reported seeing him near the barn that morning. He denied everything, of course, claimed he'd just been passing by, but his hands were clean, too clean, recently scrubbed, and he had no alibi for the crucial hours before the fire started. The evidence was circumstantial, but the community's judgment was absolute. Whether Benson had lit the match himself or paid someone else to do it, he was responsible. The same crowd that had come with torches 2 months ago now turned their fury on the man who'd actually succeeded in burning down what they'd been prevented from destroying. Benson resigned in disgrace 2 days later and left Thornwick entirely, driven out by shame and social pressure that made every moment in town unbearable. But his departure didn't rebuild the barn. Elara sat in the cottage that night, surrounded by the few possessions she owned, facing an impossible question. What now? The horses needed shelter for the coming winter. The trust fund had money, but rebuilding would take months, and they didn't have months. Without the barn, she couldn't fulfill Ruth's vision. Without that, what claim did she have to stay? Mrs. Pierce had made her position clear. The fire proves this situation is unsafe. The barn is destroyed. You have no adequate shelter for the animals, and you nearly died trying to save one horse. I'm recommending immediate placement in a group home where you'll be properly cared for. Harold Finch was fighting the recommendation, but even he admitted the situation looked grim. We need to show you can provide for yourself and the horses. Without the barn, that's going to be difficult. Elara went to the pasture where the horses were grazing under the stars. Storm approached her immediately, his large head lowering to her level, and she pressed her face against his neck and finally let herself cry. For the barn, for Ruth, for her parents, for the crushing weight of responsibility she'd taken on and couldn't sustain. "I'm sorry," she whispered to him. I really tried, but I don't know how to fix this." Storm's response was to nuzzle her gently, his breath warm against her hair. And as he did, the other horses gathered around, the same protective circle they'd formed that first night when she'd slept in the barn. They couldn't speak, couldn't offer solutions, but they offered their presence, their trust, their solidarity with someone who'd fought for them. And that's how the town found them at dawn. Word had spread overnight about Mrs. Pierce's recommendation, about Elara potentially losing custody of the horses, about the sanctuary being destroyed, and as the sun rose over the blackened ruins of the barn, people started arriving. They came with wagons full of lumber, with tools, with food and water and determination written on faces that had once gathered to destroy what they now came to rebuild. Mrs. Haley and her family, Thomas and his whole crew from the bakery, Dr. Morton with several farmers he'd recruited, the blacksmith, the feed store owner, the hardware store owner who donated paint before now, bringing nails and hammers, and his entire staff. Even families who'd never helped before showed up, driven by guilt over Benson's arson, by shame over how close they'd come to doing the same thing months earlier, by a collective realization that this barn represented something important, a place where broken things could heal, where the abandoned could find sanctuary, where a community's capacity for compassion could be measured. Harold Finch appeared with architectural plans. Ruth had drawn up expansion plans years ago, but never had the money to implement them. The trust fund can cover it now. We're not just rebuilding, we're building better. Bigger stalls, better ventilation, proper fire safety measures, space for a dozen more horses if needed. Mrs. Pierce watched the mobilization with visible surprise. When Elara approached her, the severe woman's expression was complicated, still official, still bound by regulations, but also witnessing something those regulations hadn't accounted for. "This changes things," Mrs. Pierce admitted. "This level of community support, these resources being dedicated to your care and the horses' care, I can't recommend removal when the entire town is rallying to ensure you have what you need. So I can stay? On several conditions. You'll enroll in formal schooling. Mr. Finch is arranging for a tutor to come 3 times weekly, supplemented by regular school attendance. You'll have medical checkups every 3 months. The county will do quarterly inspections to ensure the horses are being properly maintained. And you'll have adult supervision. Dr. Morton has agreed to live in the cottage's guest room on weekdays to serve as your guardian." The conditions were reasonable, and Elara accepted them immediately, relief flooding through her so powerfully she felt lightheaded. Over the next 3 months, the new barn rose from the ashes of the old. The entire community contributed, some with labor, others with materials, still others with food for the workers or money to cover costs the trust fund couldn't reach. Children from town came after school to help, learning about horses and responsibility, and the satisfaction of building something meaningful. The new barn was magnificent, larger than Ruth's original, with modern safety features and beautiful craftsmanship that honored the old while embracing the new. Each horse got a spacious stall with their name carved into a wooden plaque: Storm, Whisper, Grace, Thunder, Star, Shadow, Hope, Dawn, River, and Sky. A small office was built where Ruth's journals could be preserved and where Elara could manage the sanctuary's operations. And above the main entrance, carved into a wooden arch, were words Harold Finch had suggested, drawn from Ruth's final journal entry: "The child the horses choose, Ruth's sanctuary." The dedication ceremony was held on a bright December morning, 3 months after the fire. The whole town attended, along with people from neighboring communities who'd heard about the sanctuary and wanted to support it. Mrs. Pierce was there, no longer threatening removal, but actually smiling as she watched Elara lead Storm through the new barn, showing off the improvements. Elara stood before the crowd, small and serious, surrounded by the 10 horses who'd changed her life. "Ruth wrote that the horses would choose who should carry on her work," Elara said, her voice stronger now than it had been that first day when she'd faced down a mob. "I don't know if I'm worthy of being chosen, but I know I'll spend every day trying to be. This barn is a place for second chances, for horses society threw away, for traditions of kindness when cruelty seems easier, for a community learning to protect instead of destroy what it doesn't understand. My parents taught me to care for things that can't care for themselves. Ruth showed me that one person's compassion can create sanctuary for many, and all of you have shown me that transformation is possible, that fear can become understanding, that what's broken can be made whole again. This isn't just my sanctuary. It belongs to everyone who helped build it, everyone who chose healing over harm. Thank you for giving us this second chance. We won't waste it." The applause was thunderous, and Storm whinnied as if adding his own approval. The horses moved among the crowd, no longer wary, allowing children to pet them and adults to marvel at their recovery. What had been cursed became blessed. What had been feared became beloved. And the transformation was complete. Winter settled over Thornwick with unusual gentleness that year, as if the universe itself was granting the sanctuary time to establish its rhythms before testing it with harsh weather. Elara fell into routines that became as natural as breathing: morning feedings before the sun rose, lessons with her tutor in the cottage's small study, afternoons working with the horses under Dr. Morton's patient guidance, evenings helping Thomas with whatever repairs or improvements the barn still needed. The community that had once gathered with torches now gathered for different reasons. Mrs. Haley started a weekly program where town children could come learn about horses, with Elara serving as their teacher, despite being barely older than some of her students. The blacksmith's daughter, Anne, proved to have a natural talent for riding, and Whisper bonded with her so completely that Dr. Morton joked they were two souls sharing one heart. Requests came from neighboring towns. Could the sanctuary take in other horses? A draft horse too old to work the fields anymore. A pony whose family could no longer afford to keep her. A mare who'd gone lame and was destined for slaughter until someone remembered Ruth's sanctuary was operating again under new management. Elara consultee. Harold Finch about each request, learning to balance compassion with practicality. The barn could hold 12 horses comfortably with the new design. They currently had 10. That left room for 2 more, but only if the trust fund could sustain their care. Ruth always said no to horses she couldn't help, Finch reminded her. Said yes to everything meant being able to do nothing well. Focus on doing excellent care for fewer animals rather than mediocre care for many. Elara took the draft horse and the pony, both of whom integrated into the herd with surprising ease. The draft horse, whom she named Gentle, became Storm's closest companion, the 2 males often grazing side by side in companionable silence. The pony, Clover, attached herself to Sky, and the 2 smallest members of the herd became inseparable. But with only 12 horses and a barn designed for 20, Elara began thinking about expansion in a different direction. She approached Dr. Morton one evening as they cleaned stalls together. "What if we didn't just rescue horses?" she asked. "What if we rescued people too?" Dr. Morton paused mid-rake. "Explain." "There are other kids like me, orphans, foster children who age out of the system with nowhere to go. What if they could come here, learn about horses, learn skills that could help them build lives? We have the space. We have the knowledge to share. Why not use it?" Dr. Morton considered this seriously. "It would require different licensing, background checks, training in child welfare beyond what you or I possess. But the principle is sound. Ruth rescued horses because they were abandoned. You were abandoned too, and the horses rescued you. There's symmetry in extending that further." The idea took root and grew. Harold Finch researched the legal requirements for becoming a therapeutic foster placement. Mrs. Pierce surprisingly became an advocate, helping navigate the bureaucratic maze of certifications and approvals. Dr. Morton arranged for training in trauma-informed care for both himself and Elara. 6 months after the new barn's dedication, the sanctuary received its first human resident besides Elara, a boy named Peter, 11 years old, who'd been in 7 foster homes in 3 years and had developed a reputation for being difficult and withdrawn. His social worker brought him on a trial visit, warning Elara that he might not engage, that horses wouldn't magically fix whatever was broken inside him. Peter stood in the barn's entrance, arms crossed defensively, and Elara recognized the posture immediately. It was how Storm had stood when he first came to Ruth's barn, ready to fight or flee, trusting nothing, expecting pain. She didn't try to convince Peter of anything, just handed him a brush and led him to Grace's stall. "This is Grace," Elara said. "She was beaten by her previous owner. Took her 8 months to let anyone touch her without flinching. Now she's one of the gentlest horses here. You can help groom her if you want, or you can just sit and watch. Either's fine." Peter took the brush uncertainly and approached Grace with the kind of careful, fearful movement that spoke of experience with things that lashed out without warning. But Grace just stood peacefully, and when Peter tentatively touched the brush to her coat, she made a soft sound of contentment. Something in Peter's expression shifted. Not dramatically, not a sudden transformation from closed to open, just the slightest softening around his eyes, the smallest relaxation of his defensive posture. He brushed Grace in silence for 20 minutes, and when his social worker said it was time to go, Peter looked back at the horse with something that might have been longing. "Can I come back?" he asked Elara. "Anytime." Peter became a regular visitor, then a weekend resident, then a full-time member of the sanctuary family. He bonded especially with Thunder, a gelding who'd been neglected to the point of starvation and had the same wary distrust of caregivers that Peter carried. Together, boy and horse healed in parallel, learning to trust again through patient, consistent kindness. More children followed, not many. The sanctuary was licensed for 4 at a time. and Elara was careful never to exceed capacity. But each one who came found what Elara had found that first desperate night. A place where being broken didn't mean being worthless, where second chances were freely given, where the abandoned protected each other. The children worked with the horses, learned responsibility through feeding schedules and stall cleaning, discovered self-worth through being needed and depended upon. Some stayed months, some stayed years. All of them left changed, carrying with them the knowledge that healing was possible and sanctuary was real. The town watched this evolution with pride that had once been shame. Thornwick became known throughout the state as the place where Ruth's vision had been fulfilled beyond her imagining, where horses and humans alike found refuge and transformation. On the third anniversary of Elara taking ownership of the barn, Ruth's attorney Harold Finch arrived with a letter he'd been instructed to deliver on this specific date. It was Ruth's handwriting, addressed to Elara, sealed with wax 3 years earlier. Elara opened it with trembling hands and read, "Dear child, the horses chose. If you're reading this, 3 years have passed since you took responsibility for my sanctuary. 3 years is long enough to know if you have the strength for this work, the heart for it, the dedication it requires. I don't know who you are. I don't know your name or your story, but the horses knew, and I trusted them more than I trusted my own judgment. They chose correctly. I'm certain of it. The sanctuary is more than a place. It's an idea that what's broken deserves to be healed, that what's abandoned deserves to be found, that compassion is not weakness but the strongest force in human experience. You've proven that idea true just by surviving these 3 years. My deepest hope is that you've made the sanctuary your own, that you've expanded it beyond what I could imagine, that you've taken my small dream and made it vast. Don't be bound by what I built. Build. What the world needs next. The horses will guide you. They always do. Trust them, trust yourself, and know that somewhere beyond this life, I'm grateful you answered the call I couldn't voice but believed would be heard. With love and blessing, Ruth." Elara read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, before carefully folding it and placing it in the sanctuary's archive, where Ruth's journals were preserved. That night, she stood in the pasture surrounded by horses, not just the original 10, though they were all there, but the 22 who now called the sanctuary home, thanks to the second barn they had built the previous summer. Peter stood beside her, now 14, and planning to become a veterinarian. Anne was there too, having just been hired as the sanctuary's first official junior trainer. Thomas had graduated and taken a job managing the sanctuary's logistics and community outreach. The family they'd built from abandonment and choice surrounded Elara under a sky full of stars. "Ruth was right," Elara said quietly. "The horses did choose correctly." Storm nuzzled her shoulder, his scarred coat silvered with moonlight, his presence a reminder of that first desperate night when 10 horses had formed a protective circle around a freezing child and changed the course of all their lives. The sanctuary was more than buildings and animals now. It was proof of transformation, evidence that broken things could find purpose, testament to the power of choosing compassion over fear. And it belonged to all of them, the abandoned who became the protectors, the rescued who became the healers, the ones the world had overlooked until horses saw what humans had missed. They were family, and family, Elara had learned, was something you built from choice and care, and the stubborn refusal to let go of hope, even when the world gave you every reason to do so. The sanctuary's reputation grew like ripples, expanding across still water, reaching farther than anyone expected. News stories were written about the orphan girl who turned a cursed barn into a haven. Documentary filmmakers came to capture the children and horses healing together. Universities sent researchers wanting to study the therapeutic impact of equine-assisted recovery for traumatized youth. But growth brought new challenges. A wealthy developer from the city arrived one spring morning with an offer to buy the property for 3 times its value. He wanted to turn it into a luxury resort, capitalizing on the scenic beauty and the proximity to Thornwick's increasingly popular downtown. He assured Elara that the horses would be appropriately relocated to other facilities. Elara declined without hesitation, but the developer persisted, increasing his offer, bringing lawyers who spoke about market value and fiscal responsibility and opportunities that might not come again. Harold Finch attended these meetings, his expression growing darker with each visit. Finally, he stood and physically ushered the developers out. "The sanctuary is not for sale," he said with finality. "It was never for sale. Ruth's will specifically prohibits commercial development of the property for 50 years after her death. You've wasted everyone's time." After they left, Finch sat with Elara in the barn's small office. "You'll face this again," he warned. "As Thornwick grows, as property values increase, pressure will mount to monetize this land. You need to be prepared to keep saying no." "That's easy," Elara replied. "The sanctuary isn't mine to sell. It belongs to everyone who found healing here. You can't put a price on that." But saying no had consequences. The developer complained to county officials about zoning violations that didn't exist. Anonymous complaints were filed about noise and odor, though the sanctuary maintained meticulous cleanliness. Building inspectors arrived weekly, searching for violations they never found. The harassment was designed to make operating the sanctuary so difficult that Elara would eventually give up and accept a buyout. It might have worked on someone else, but Elara had faced down a mob with torches and rebuilt from ashes. Bureaucratic harassment was annoying, but it wasn't existential. What did worry her was the children. The sanctuary now housed 6 full-time and had a waiting list of 20 more who needed placement. Each child came with their own trauma, their own needs, their own journey toward healing. Elara was 18 now, officially aged out of foster care herself, but grandfathered into legal ownership of the sanctuary through Ruth's will. But she was still young, still learning, still discovering that wisdom and age weren't the same thing. A crisis came in the form of a boy named David, 15 and angry at the world with good reason. He'd been abused in multiple foster homes, had developed behavioral problems that made him unadoptable, and came to the sanctuary as a last resort before juvenile detention. David didn't want to be there, didn't want to work with horses, didn't want help or healing or any of the things the sanctuary offered. He was hostile to the other children, dismissive of the staff, and cruel to the horses in small ways he thought no one noticed. But Elara noticed, saw him yanking on halters too hard, smacking horses when they didn't move fast enough, enjoying the power he had over creatures who couldn't fight back. She confronted him one evening after finding him deliberately frightening Sky, backing the small mare into a corner and laughing at her terror. "You need to stop," Elara said, her voice quiet but firm. "Or what?" David sneered. "You'll send me away? Go ahead. I don't want to be here anyway. This place is a joke. You pretend horses can heal people, but it's all feel-good garbage that doesn't change anything." "The horses don't heal people," Elara corrected. "People heal themselves by learning to care for something other than their own pain. But you can't learn that if you're too busy inflicting pain on others. You don't know anything about me. I know you're hurting. I know the world's been cruel to you. I know you're scared that if you let yourself care about anything, it'll just be taken away like everything else has been." Elara met his eyes steadily. "But hurting horses won't protect you from being hurt. It just makes you into the thing you hate." David's expression wavered, something breaking through the anger for just a moment before hardening again. "I want to leave." "Then leave. The door's not locked. You can walk away anytime." Elara's voice softened. "But if you stay, you follow the rules. You treat the horses with respect. You do the work. And you give yourself a chance to become someone other than what trauma made you." He stayed, but things got worse before they got better. David broke equipment, skipped chores, got into fights with other children. Dr. Morton counseled patients, but even his considerable reserves were tested. Several staff members suggested David needed more intensive therapeutic intervention than the sanctuary could provide. Then Storm intervened in a way no human could. David was in the pasture one afternoon, alone and angry about something, kicking at fence posts and cursing. Storm approached him slowly, deliberately, his massive presence impossible to ignore. David told him to go away, tried to shoo him off. But Storm just stood there, looking at David with eyes that had seen their own share of abuse and rage and hopelessness. And David broke. He collapsed against Storm's shoulder and sobbed with the kind of deep body-shaking grief that comes from years of swallowing pain. Storm didn't move, just stood like a mountain, absorbing the storm of David's anguish with the patience of something that understood suffering from the inside. When David finally pulled himself together, embarrassed and raw, Storm nuzzled him gently, not judging, not demanding, just offering the kind of uncomplicated acceptance David had never experienced from humans. The change wasn't instantaneous. David still had hard days, still struggled with anger and mistrust, but he stopped being cruel, started doing his chores without being asked, began working with Storm specifically, the two of them moving together with a synchronicity that suggested deep mutual understanding. 6 months later, David was leading therapeutic riding sessions for younger children. His own healing advanced enough that he could guide others. His social worker called it miraculous. Elara called it the work of horses who understood human brokenness better than most therapists. The years accumulated like sediment, each one adding layers of experience and wisdom to Elara's understanding of the sanctuary's purpose. She was 22 when the state approached her about expanding the model, creating satellite sanctuaries in other counties, training other caretakers to replicate what she'd built in Thornwick. The idea was both exciting and terrifying. Exciting because it meant Ruth's vision could reach more children and horses who needed it. Terrifying because expansion meant potentially diluting the personal care and attention that made the sanctuary work. Elara spent months researching, visiting other therapeutic facilities, consulting with experts in trauma recovery and animal-assisted therapy. She learned what worked and what didn't, what could be systematized and what required the kind of intuitive, individual attention that didn't scale easily. Finally, she developed a model, small satellite sanctuaries, each serving no more than 10 children and 20 horses, each led by someone who'd been through the program themselves and understood its principles from lived experience. Peter, now in veterinary school, agreed to run the first satellite facility once he completed his degree. David, who'd become certified in equine therapy, would run the second. The expansion was slow and careful, each new location chosen for community support and sustainable funding, but it worked. Within 5 years, there were 7 Ruth sanctuaries across 3 states, each one a beacon for the abandoned seeking healing. The original sanctuary in Thornwick remained the flagship, the place where new CareTech grew and where Elara herself continued to live and work. She'd been offered positions at prestigious therapeutic facilities, been invited to speak at conferences worldwide, received job offers that would have made her wealthy beyond Ruth's modest trust fund. She declined them all. The sanctuary was her home, her purpose, the place where she'd been chosen and now did the choosing. But even home presented difficult decisions. Storm was aging. 25 years old now, his coat more silver than black, his movements slower but still dignified. He'd been the sanctuary's heart since Elara first arrived, the horse who'd formed that first protective circle and showed her what it meant to be chosen. Dr. Morton was gentle when he delivered the diagnosis. Cancer, advanced, treatable but not curable. They could buy him months with treatment, but it would be painful and diminishing. Or they could let him go peacefully now, before suffering became all he knew. Elara sat with Storm in his stall that night, her head pressed against his neck, and tried to find the wisdom for an impossible choice. The children who'd been healed by working with him, the horses he'd protected and befriended, the legacy he represented. How could she let that go? But Storm answered the question himself. When she looked into his eyes, she saw peace, not fear, not fighting, just calm acceptance of what was coming, and trust that she'd do what needed doing. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." They held the ceremony 3 days later. Every child who'd ever been helped by Storm came back if they could. Young adults now, many with families of their own, all of them wanting to say goodbye to the horse who'd taught them about strength and gentleness. The entire town showed up. Even Mrs. Pierce, retired now, stood in the crowd with tears streaming down her face. Dr. Morton administered the injection himself, and Storm passed surrounded by everyone he'd protected and all the love his massive heart had earned. They buried him in the sanctuary's memorial garden, where Ruth herself had been interred years earlier, and planted an oak tree over his grave that would grow strong and sheltering like he'd been. The sanctuary felt emptier after Storm was gone, but his legacy lived on in the horses who'd learned from him how to be protectors, in the children who'd learned from him how to trust again, in the sanctuaries bearing Ruth's name that spread across the region like seeds from a single remarkable tree. Elara was 28 when she took in her final personal placement. Not a child this time, but an elderly woman named Helen, whose family had put her in a nursing home and forgotten her. Helen had spent her life breeding horses, and dementia was slowly stealing her memories, but her muscle memory remained. Put her near a horse and she came alive, her hands remembering what her mind had forgotten. Helen lived her final 2 years in the cottage's guest room, spending every day with the horses, teaching the children everything she remembered about bloodlines and breeding and the particular magic of working with creatures who spoke without words. When she passed peacefully in her sleep, the children cried as hard as they had for Storm because the sanctuary had taught them that grief was the price of love, and both were worth it. The sanctuary evolved, but its core purpose remained constant: to be a place where the abandoned could find sanctuary, where broken things could heal, where transformation was always possible no matter how dark the past had been. News of Elara's work reached international attention when a documentary about the sanctuary won awards and sparked conversations about trauma recovery and the healing power of the human-animal bond. Offers poured in for book deals, speaking tours, consulting contracts. Elara accepted some, the ones that would fund more sanctuaries, the ones that would spread Ruth's vision further. But she remained grounded in the daily work of caring for horses and children, because that's where the real transformation happened, in the quiet moments of grooming and feeding and sitting in comfortable silence with creatures who asked nothing more than consistent kindness. On the 25th anniversary of the night Elara first found shelter in Ruth's barn, the sanctuary held a celebration. Hundreds of people gathered, children who'd healed there, families who'd volunteered, community members who'd helped build and rebuild, staff from all 7 satellite locations. The original barn had been expanded again, now capable of housing 30 horses comfortably. The property had grown through adjacent land purchases, creating a sprawling campus that included the main barn, 3 smaller specialized facilities, a therapeutic riding arena, classroom buildings, and housing for staff and residents. But the heart of it all remained Ruth's original cottage and the memorial garden, where Storm and Ruth rested beneath growing oak trees. Elara stood before the crowd, 33 years old now, no longer the desperate 8-year-old child who'd stumbled into a cursed barn seeking shelter from a storm. She'd built a life, a legacy, a family from choice and determination, and the stubborn refusal to accept that abandoned things were worthless. Ruth wrote in her journal that the horses would choose, Elara began, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. She trusted them to see what humans might miss, and they chose a freezing child who had nothing to offer but need and a willingness to try. But the real miracle wasn't that they chose me, it's what happened after. A town that had branded this place cursed learned to see it as holy ground. Children who'd been thrown away by the system learned they had value. Horses who'd been brutalized learned they could trust again. All because one woman believed that broken things deserved to be healed and passed that belief forward. Ruth's sanctuary isn't named after a person. It's named after a principle, that we're all worthy of second chances, that compassion creates transformation, that the strongest walls we can build are the ones made from choosing to protect what's vulnerable. 25 years ago, 10 horses formed a protective circle around me while I slept. They created a sanctuary with their bodies when I had nowhere else to go. Everything that's happened since, every child who's healed here, every horse who's found safety, every life that's been changed grew from that single night when the abandoned chose to protect each other. We're all here because we believe that principle still matters, that creating sanctuary isn't just about buildings and land, but about choosing every day to be the kind of people who form protective circles around what's vulnerable. Thank you for being part of that choice. After the formal ceremony, Elara walked alone to the memorial garden. The oak trees had grown tall and strong, their branches creating a canopy of green that filtered sunlight into patterns of gold and shadow. She sat on the bench between Ruth's and Storm's graves and felt the presence of those who'd started this journey, even though they couldn't finish it themselves. A small sound made her turn. A mare stood at the garden's entrance, one of the newest rescues, barely a year old, found abandoned and starving beside a highway. Her coat was still patchy from malnutrition, her eyes still wary, but she'd ventured out of her stall seeking something, seeking Elara. The filly approached slowly, testing each step, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. Elara remained perfectly still, letting the young horse make all the choices, understanding that trust couldn't be rushed or forced. Finally, the filly touched her nose to Elara's hand, and Elara felt the familiar spark of connection that had defined her life for 25 years. This small, frightened creature was choosing to trust, choosing to hope, choosing to believe that not all humans would hurt her. "I see you," Elara whispered, "and I promise you're safe here." The filly stayed for several minutes, soaking up Elara's presence like sunlight, before returning to her stall with slightly less fear than she'd carried before. And Elara sat beneath the oak trees thinking about circles, how the protective circle those first 10 horses formed around her had expanded to encompass hundreds of children and horses, how every act of compassion rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict or control, how the abandoned became the protectors who then protected others in an endless cycle of healing. That night, as she did most nights, Elara walked through the barn, checking on each horse, calling them by name, touching them gently to let them know they were seen and valued. 30 horses now, each with their own story of survival, each carrying scars visible and invisible, each deserving of the sanctuary they had found. When she reached the far end of the barn, she found Peter there, back from his own sanctuary for the celebration, grooming Thunder with the patient care he'd learned during his own healing. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you'd kept walking that night?" Peter asked. "If you'd passed the barn and gone somewhere else?" Elara considered the question seriously. "I think the horses would have found someone else. Maybe not that night, but eventually. Ruth's vision was always bigger than one person. The sanctuary existed in potential before I arrived. I just helped make it real." "You did more than help. You built this." Peter gestured at the barn, the thriving operation beyond, the legacy that bore Ruth's name but carried Elara's heart. "We built it," Elara corrected. "Every person who chose compassion over convenience, every child who did the hard work of healing, every horse who trusted again, despite having every reason not to. This belongs to all of us." They worked together in comfortable silence, the barn filled with the sounds of horses settling for the night, and Elara felt the deep satisfaction of work that mattered, continuing beyond her individual contribution. The sanctuary would outlast her, just as it had outlasted Ruth, would continue evolving, growing, adapting to whatever the world needed next. Because that's what sanctuary did. It transformed to meet new suffering with the old answer: you are seen, you are valued, you are safe here. And that answer, Elara had learned over 25 years, was always enough. Dawn came to the sanctuary like a benediction, soft light spreading across the pastures where horses grazed in contentment, touching the memorial garden where oak trees whispered with leaves that sounded almost like voices blessing the living, warming the barn where the last night sounds gave way to morning's gentle stirring. Elara stood at the same spot she'd stood 25 years earlier, just outside the barn's main entrance, looking out at land that held more stories than any book could contain. But this morning was different. This morning, she wasn't alone. The newest filly stood beside her, the one who'd sought her out in the memorial garden the day before. In the night, the young horse had formed an attachment, had chosen Elara as her person, the way Storm had chosen her all those years ago. And Elara had learned enough to recognize the gift for what it was. Not ownership, but stewardship. Not possession, but sacred trust. She'd named the filly Dawn because she represented new beginnings while honoring all that had come before. "Ready to see your home?" Elara asked the filly, and together they walked the property as the sanctuary woke around them, past the main barn where 30 horses stirred in their stalls, each one a story of survival and second chances. Past the training arena where children would arrive later for their therapeutic sessions, learning that their worth wasn't diminished by their trauma. Past the classroom buildings where former residents now taught others what they'd learned about resilience and healing. Past the cottage where Elara still lived, keeping Ruth's rooms exactly as they'd been, maintaining them as a museum and reminder of where the vision started. Past the gardens where volunteers from town would arrive to help with the day's planting, their labor a living apology for the fear they'd once carried toward this place. And finally, back to the memorial garden, where oak trees stretched toward a sky that promised fair weather, where graves held those who'd started journeys they couldn't finish, where the living came to remember that ending and beginning were often the same thing viewed from different angles. Dawn grazed on the grass between Ruth's and Storm's graves, unaware of the significance, just enjoying the sweet morning and the safety that surrounded her completely. Elara sat on the bench and pulled out Ruth's first journal, the one that detailed finding Storm broken and terrified, nursing him back to health, discovering that healing one creature created capacity to heal many. She read the entries she'd read hundreds of times before, finding new meaning in words that had shaped her understanding of purpose and grace. Sanctuary isn't a place, Ruth had written. It's a promise. The promise that no matter what the world has done to you, there exists space where you can rest, heal, and discover that your wounds don't define your worth. Building that space requires more than walls and fences. It requires people willing to stand between the vulnerable and violence, willing to say, not here, not anymore, and mean it with everything they have. Elara closed the journal and looked at Dawn, at the filly who'd been hours from death before a highway patrol officer found her and called the sanctuary. She thought about the circle of protection, how it had started with 10 horses around one child and expanded to encompass hundreds, how each act of compassion created space for more compassion, how standing for the vulnerable attracted others willing to stand until whole communities transformed. The town of Thornwick had changed beyond recognition. The cursed barn was now their pride, the source of tourism and respect that put them on maps and in documentary films. Children grew up volunteering at the sanctuary, learning that caring for broken things was noble work. Adults who'd once carried torches now carried feed buckets and repair tools, and the quiet pride of having chosen redemption over destruction. But the change that mattered most was internal, individual, the 1,000 small choices people made daily to protect rather than harm, to heal rather than abandon, to see value where others saw only burden. Peter had called last night with news. The 7th satellite sanctuary was ready to open. This one in a state that had never had equine therapy programs before. They'd trained staff, secured funding, found community support. They'd replicated the model successfully, proof that what worked in Thornwick could work anywhere people chose compassion over convenience. "We're changing the world," Peter had said, with the enthusiasm of someone still young enough to believe it. "We're changing corners of it," Elara had corrected gently. "One horse, one child, one choice at a time. That's all we can do. That's all we need to do." Because that was the truth Ruth had understood and passed forward. Transformation didn't require grand gestures or sweeping reforms, though those had their place. It required daily, consistent choosing of kindness over cruelty, of protection over abandonment, of hope over despair. Elara had chosen that path. The night she'd stayed in a barn, everyone said was cursed, and trusted the horses who formed a protective circle around her. Had kept choosing it every day since, through fires and bureaucratic harassment, through grief and exhaustion, through moments when giving up seemed easier than persisting. And every choice had mattered, every horse saved, every child welcomed, every volunteer trained, every community member who learned to see differently. The ripples spread farther than she could track, touching lives she'd never know about, creating sanctuaries she'd never visit, inspiring transformations she'd never witness. That was the real miracle. Not that one child and 10 horses survived, but that their survival became a catalyst for countless other survivals, for a movement that turned fear into understanding and abandoned places into holy ground. Dawn finished grazing and returned to Elara, pressing her soft muzzle against Elara's hand. The same gesture Storm had made 25 years ago. The same promise being renewed with each generation. "I see you. I choose you. Together we build sanctuary." Elara stood and walked with Dawn back toward the barn, where the day's work awaited. Horses to feed, children to teach, wounds to heal, hope to nurture. The work never ended, but it never diminished either. Each day brought new opportunities to stand between the vulnerable and violence, to create space where broken things could become whole. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning mist, and the sanctuary emerged clear and sharp against the landscape. Buildings that had been built and rebuilt, pastures that had been fought for and defended, a community that had been transformed through the stubborn insistence that every life mattered regardless of whether the world agreed. Ruth's vision had been simple: save what could be saved, heal what could be healed, and trust that compassion created more compassion like ripples spreading across still water. Elara had taken that vision and made it vast, but the principle remained the same. Sanctuary wasn't a place. It was a promise. And 25 years after 10 horses formed a protective circle around a freezing child, that promise was still being kept, still expanding, still transforming fear into hope, one brave choice at a time. The abandoned protected each other, the broken became whole, and the cursed barn became a beacon of light that darkness could never quite extinguish, no matter how hard it tried.